It's great to see such a great turnout, and we will get going. I'm Sandy Wagner, and I'm a past president of the Vancouver Island Strata Owners Association. I'm not on the board at this time. I've retired. I am a strata owner, just like most of you that are attending. And I have been on Strata Council many times over my years as a strata owner. I've been a strata owner since 1992. Holy cow, that's a long time. And I've been on Strata Council many times and learned over the years so many things that I hope will be helpful for you. So this is what we're going to cover today. We'll talk about everything to do with privacy policies, why you should have one, when you should have one, who should create it, how to create it, what goes in it, and what happens if you don't have one. And we'll get into all of those in detail. Now, the privacy policy, the Office of the Information Privacy Commissioner, and the Personal Information Protection Act can be a bit confusing, but we'll walk you through this, and we've got some great resources that'll pop up a couple of times for you. So the privacy legislation, if you were to just read the act, just like the Strata Property Act, it's not easy reading, but I'm going to just highlight some of the key points for you. So the Personal Information Protection Act, which we'll call PIPA, it regulates the information and privacy practices of corporations, not-for-profits, charities, trade unions, and other private organizations that collect, use, or disclose personal information. And yes, that does include a strata corporation. PIPA is an act that is all about privacy in the private sector. So it describes how all organizations must handle personal information of employees and the public, if you happen to collect information from the public, which a strata wouldn't. But the key thing is about your strata's owners. And PIPA has some common sense rules about collecting, using, and disclosing that personal information. It really it can be simple, and hopefully we'll break it down for you. So it's all about balance, right? There's two competing principles here. There's the individual's right to protect their personal information, and there's the organization's need to collect, use, or disclose personal information for reasonable purposes. So always keep those things in mind. We have to balance the individual's right to privacy with the organization's need to collect and use that information. So PIPA will trump the other acts of British Columbia. So if a section of PIPA conflicts with another BC act or regulation, PIPA must be followed unless the other act states that PIPA does not apply. And we'll talk about that a little more as well. So what is a privacy policy? It's just a set of standards, procedures, and policies that ensure your strata is collecting, using, storing personal information appropriately. Now, why should you have a privacy policy? Well, you're required under PIPA. You're required to develop and follow policies and practices necessary to meet your obligations. Your strata is legally obligated to protect any personal information that you collect, use, or disclose. And you're going to say, well, we don't collect a lot of personal information, but you collect more than you think, and we're going to talk about that as well. When should you have a privacy policy? Well, the PIPA received royal assent on October 23rd of 2003. So good grief, that's 18 years ago, almost. I know it didn't really have a lot of attention when it came out in 2003. For government agencies, they know all about collecting and disclosing and safeguarding personal information, but for the private sector, you really didn't receive a lot of information. I know in the strata I lived in at the time, we happened to have a council member who was a government employee, and so we knew a little bit about it, but most of you probably didn't. So when should you have a privacy policy? The sooner the better. Now, as for who should create your privacy policy, it shouldn't be the work of one person. All council members ideally should participate. That's just a best practice, but you could also strike a committee of interested owners to assist with the first draft. And it's not going to be something you're going to sit down and do in 20 minutes. It's going to take you some hours, and hopefully you have several people with input, because nobody is going to remember all the personal information you have. Nobody's going to remember all the reasons you collect everything. but we do have some resources that'll help you along the way. So, but let's pretend you've already got your privacy policy done. Where is it kept? Should be kept with your other important Strata documents. If you happen to have a Strata website or a portal, definitely post it up there for the owners to read, to view. Post it on a bulletin board. My Strata's got it posted right on our bulletin board in our common area, and send a copy to all owners, tenants, and occupants. How often should you look at it? Yes, you don't just make a privacy policy and throw it on a shelf, just like your depreciation report. You don't do a depreciation report and stick it on a shelf and tick a box and say it's done. You should look at your privacy policy fairly frequently because your risks to exposing personal information, they do evolve over time. You might start collecting information in a different way than you did before. So you want to conduct a risk assessment at least annually, and that it would be an important part of your privacy management program. So perhaps your first council meeting of the new term, you might want to talk about it, or at least set a date to deal with it. Now, if you have a Strata management company, it's going to be a little bit different. I know in the Strata that I'm in now, we didn't have a privacy policy until I said, hey, how come we don't have a privacy policy? And they said, well, the management company keeps all the information. But they do it as an agent of the Strata Corporation, which means that the Strata Corporation itself actually holds this personal information. So if you have a good privacy management program, all members of the organization need to be aware of and be ready to act on your privacy obligations. Now, your management company probably has their own privacy policy. They certainly should, and you can refer to this within your Strata's privacy policy. So now we'll get into the nuts and bolts of today's webinar, how to create that privacy policy. And we have some really good resources for you. If you go to our homepage, go to the resources section, go to resource links, and then scroll down to the privacy section. And we'll list each of those resources near the end of today's slideshow, but that just tells you how to get to the privacy resources. The first thing that you'll see under, one of the things you'll see under the resources is this template. And this is just a screenshot of the very first part of the template. And this is literally a fill in the blanks Word document. So everything that's highlighted in yellow is where you might want to change it to specifically identify your Strata and the differences for your Strata. So it's adapted from a privacy policy template created by the OIPC, that's the Office of the Information Privacy Commissioner. They created it for business use, and it's been adapted for Strata Corporation. So that is going to be your #1 resource. I believe that'll be emailed out to attendees afterwards, but you can certainly find it easily on the Visoa website. Now, what goes into your privacy policy? So the template will have sections for collecting personal information, consent to collect that information, how you use and disclose personal information, how you retain personal information, ensuring the accuracy, how you secure personal information, how you provide access to personal information, and it'll also have a section on questions and complaints. But really, I always keep these few things in mind. Your privacy policy needs to identify what personal information you collect, why you collect it, and how you safeguard it. That's the crux of it. So you might collect more personal information than you think. You're going to say, well, we don't have anybody's personal information. We've got their phone numbers. I guess that's what we've got. But no, you have a ton of personal information on your owners. You've got their name, their address, their email address. You might know who their employer is. You've probably got their home and work telephone numbers. You might have some health information if they've said, you know, they've filled in some emergency contact sheet that says they need a, you know, some assistance. You've probably got phone numbers, contact information of relatives. You've got their insurance details, vehicle information, license plate. You may also be collecting that information for other household members as well. So just think about the number of personal pieces of information you collect on your owners and occupants. But there's more. You've probably got their bank account numbers. You may have credit card numbers. You might have mortgage information. You have information, of course, on any debts owed to the Strata Corporation. If you have a fob system for entry, you might be collecting data on their comings and goings. If you have cameras, you might be collecting data on their visiting habits, you know, where they're going, what time they're going there. So think about all that huge amount of personal information you're collecting about your owners. Now you're also going to be collecting contact information, and contact information is not considered personal information under PIPA, but you do need to protect it with the same degree of diligence. So personal information does not include information that enables an individual to be contacted at a place of business. So their name, business address or business telephone number, business email. That's contact information, it's not personal information. So alongside of PIPA, of course, you've got to remember that the Strata Property Act requires you to keep certain documents. So you need to keep a list, of course, of owners with their strata lot addresses, their mailing address, their parking lot number, their parking stall, and unit entitlement, the basics. You also need to keep a list of any mortgagees who filed a mortgagee's request for notification. You need to keep a list of names of tenants, and if there's been assignment of voting rights by landlords to their tenants under 147 and 148 of the Strata Property Act. So remember, you must keep that information. And you have to disclose copies of the information upon request to an owner or a tenant who's been assigned the landlord's rights, or a person authorized in writing by an owner or tenant. And so typically in your privacy policy, you'll mention the fact that you're collecting specific information because the Strata Property Act requires you to do so. And under the disclosure section, you'll state that you'll disclose it because the Strata Property Act will require you to do so. But I know that a lot of stratas have this question: when an owner asks for a list of owners, is that private information that we can't provide? No, you cannot say no. It's not protected by PIPA, as it's required under another act. If an owner asks for a list of owners with their mailing addresses, you must provide it. It's not protected. But this is what Strata Property 36 doesn't say. There is no authorization under the Strata Property Act to provide email addresses or phone numbers to any other owner. The Strata Council, the Strata Corporation might need that information for communication purposes, but you're not to provide it to other owners. If you do happen to have a list of all owners with their email address or their phone number, each person on that list must specifically authorize the Strata to share the information. So think about that. If you're in a small strata, you probably all have each other's phone numbers and email addresses. But if the Strata Corporation is sharing that information rather than each owner sharing it on their own, then the Strata has to have authorization from each person on the list to share the information. And that is a good segue into consent. So there are some times when collection of somebody's personal information is obvious, but most of the time you must obtain consent. So for example, an opt-in form for sending notices by email. You can't just automatically assume that because you have somebody's email address, you can provide official Strata notice by email. There should be an opt-in form for that. And owners can withhold their consent, but they need to know how withholding that consent could impact your ability to provide a specific service. So in the example above, sending notices by email, you don't have to provide your email, Mrs. Jones. Just letting you know that when we send an official notice, it'll take however long it takes to get to you in the mail, 3-4 days, maybe a bit longer. If we send it by email, you can receive it the same day as everyone else. And another example would be an unsigned bylaw complaint letter might not be actioned by Strata Council. So let owners know if they don't sign a complaint letter, it might not be actioned. So that's how you would be impacting your ability to provide a service. So think about all the collection of information and where you require consent and where you don't. A good example also is filling in any forms that the Strata asks owner to fill out. You might want to have a place on the form to identify this part of the form is required This part of the form is optional. Now, why do you collect information? Why do you collect that personal information? You need it to verify people's identity, perhaps. You certainly need it for communication. You need to identify how the owner wants you to communicate. And of course, you need to collect and process strata fee payments and other payments. So somebody somewhere has got people's bank account numbers if you're doing direct deposit of strata fees. So you've collected that information at some point. Maybe the bank has it and you're trusting that the bank is keeping it safe, but at some point you've actually collected the information as well. So that's an example of you need to identify why you're collecting it. And of course, you need to collect that various information to deliver service. You also are collecting that personal information to ensure the orderly management of your strata corporation. You might allow for video surveillance to ensure the safety of owners, residents, and guests. And your privacy policy needs to identify what video surveillance you have and what you do with that information as well. You're also collecting information to respond to emergencies and then, of course, to meet regulatory requirements. So that's the requirements of the Strata Property Act. Now, where do you store that personal information? Who's got access and how do you control access? These are all things that need to be identified in your privacy policy. So as for where you store it, you might keep it online, but think about, is it password protected? And these are all things that should be highlighted in your privacy policy. You might store many of your documents in council email accounts, but who has the access? Do all council members have access, or is it one or two? How often do you change the passwords? Again, you want to highlight and mention all these points inside your privacy policy so that everyone whose information you have understands how you deal with it. Personal contact information for other owners should be restricted to council and manager only, but you should identify that directly in your privacy policy. Banking information might be restricted to only the treasurer or manager. Just because somebody's on council doesn't necessarily mean they need everyone's banking information. Perhaps only the treasurer or the manager or the president or the treasurer if you're self-managed. Maybe only one or two people should have access to that information. So have a policy that restricts the access as appropriate. Only those that need to know have the access. So the old thing on a need to know basis. Then how long are you keeping the personal information? Your privacy policy needs to state that as well. So the Strata Property Act, the regulation, identifies how long you must keep the items identified in sections 35. So section 35 is the long list of documents you must keep. The regulation identifies how long you should keep them. And this is just an example. A list of owners, you only have to keep the correct copy. Personal information collected in support of a bylaw infraction, you need to keep that for 1 year past the date of the council decision. Correspondence, you need to keep for 2 years. Bank statements and supporting documents you keep for 6 years. And there's a wide variety of date ranges for different sorts of information that you need to keep. But these are the things that impact people's private information, personal information. Now, once you no longer need that personal information, first double check for that inside the document retention regulations to make sure you can discard or destroy that information. And if you're satisfied that you can destroy it, then think about best practices. How are you going to destroy it? And of course, it depends on how it's stored. Of course, paper copies, the best way to dispose of those is to shred them. And you may, depending on the size of your strata and the nature of the information you're saving, you might want to have a shredding program set up every 6 months or every few months, or maybe you'll do it once a year. But perhaps you want to have 2 people doing the shredding so that it's sure that those documents are in fact being shredded when they should be. They're not making their way into the trash. If you have electronic storage, you probably want to delete and then maybe double delete. Delete them from your deleted items, as they say. So your privacy policy, again, should state how and when you'll destroy personal information when it's no longer needed. Now here's the yikes page. How will you deal with privacy breaches? I love this picture. You are going to accidentally breach somebody's privacy. I almost guarantee it. It happens everywhere. Happens in my strata, happens where I work. It happens all the time. You might accidentally send out an email without doing a blind carbon copy, something as simple as that. You are going to deal with some privacy breaches. Now, your privacy policy needs to state how you will handle privacy breaches. So really the first thing you should do, these are best practices, is acknowledge that you've made the error, investigate how it happened, report back to the people affected, change your procedures, and then update your privacy policy as needed. Okay, you are going to breach somebody's privacy at some point by accident. It's just a given. We're all people, we're human, and we do make mistakes. So just remember the 5 principles. If you have made a privacy breach, acknowledge, investigate, report, change procedures, and then update your privacy policy. Now we need to talk about who is your privacy officer. Every strata corporation is required to have a privacy officer. Do you know that? I think nobody wants to be the privacy officer in my strata, but we're working on that. So best practice is a council member, not a volunteer owner. You might have an owner who says, oh, I did this in my job and I'm retired now and I'm happy to do it for the strata. Think about whether you want that to be a volunteer or whether they should be a council member, because of course the volunteer who's safeguarding the records would need access to them. Is that a task you want to volunteer to do? In a small strata, that might be perfectly fine for you. You might want to write that right into your privacy policy. But just think about whether you want your privacy officer to be a council member or not. And I always say that ideally the strata secretary should be the privacy officer, because he or she will already have access to a great deal of the records for communication purposes. That doesn't mean it must be the secretary. You could have a separate position on council called privacy officer if you wish. It's just sort of some suggestions and some best practices. Now, what if your strata doesn't have a privacy policy? What if today is the first time you're hearing that you should have one? So the Office of the Information Privacy Commissioner is not going to come looking for you. They're not going to ask for your privacy policy. They're not going to give you a big fine if you don't have one. So rest easy there. The OIPC office is complaint driven. They will not look for your privacy policy unless they are directed to your strata by some sort of a complaint or an inquiry or a question that's directed to their office. So if you don't have one, they'll require you to complete one. So you can rest a little easy there. Now, if there is an investigation by a privacy commissioner's office about a complaint, then your organization will be asked to show how it addresses the requirements of the law. So basically, if there's a complaint, the first thing they're going to ask for is your privacy policy. So if the privacy commissioner investigates a complaint in your strata, they need to have your privacy program documented, and they will expect that your strata can demonstrate you have an up-to-date, comprehensive privacy program in place. So they'll need to see your privacy policy, and this evidence of your privacy management program assists the commissioners in determining whether or not the organization has reasonable safeguards in place and has complied with the accountability requirements under the applicable law. So just because somebody makes a complaint to the privacy commissioner doesn't mean that it's a legitimate complaint. Somebody could say, well, the Strata Corporation did something, I think they're collecting information they don't need to collect. Privacy commissioner will look at your privacy policy and say, well, the reason they collect this is because it's required to provide this service. You can opt out of this service, and and they'll look at your privacy policy. They might make some suggestions on how to improve your privacy policy. But the whole goal of the privacy commissioner is education and compliance with the legislation. It's not about penalizing your strata. It's really about making sure that you are compliant with the accountability. So if you don't have an active, effective privacy policy, if you're not meeting that expectation, you will be faced with additional work to establish or update your privacy policy, your program. So that is the goal of the Privacy Commissioner, is education and making sure you have a privacy policy and making sure that it is up to date. So some final thoughts on this. So your privacy policy does not need to be a huge onerous task, but it's very important. It's very important to running your strata in a way that complies with all the other legislation. So there is plenty of information on the OIPC website, and there's a link to that on the VISOA website. There's lots of publications, including a sample, that template privacy policy, to guide you along. You may not need it until you have a breach, but by then it's too late. So just be prepared. Most important thing is just to always be ready. Be prepared in case you have an issue with privacy in your strata. So here's again the list of all the resources that are up on the VISOA website. There's a direct link to the Personal Information Protection Act. Now the OIPC office has several fabulous resources, and they're all linked on the VISOA website. There's a very long document called Privacy Guidelines for Strata Corporations and Strata Agents. And then they even have an FAQ section, frequently asked questions. The privacy policy template is on the VISOA website as well. There's information from the OIPC webinars and other materials in their privacy rights section. And there is a podcast on Strata Privacy. It's called Rights, Cameras, and Taking Action. And you might recognize a familiar voice on that podcast, actually. So here is some other resources outside of the VISOA. But again, there's a link to these on the VISOA website. The Government of BC's Strata Housing website has fabulous resources for you. And of course, oipc.bc.ca. And once you're in that website, search for the word strata. It'll bring you up all the strata resources.